Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I have to begin by expressing my deep gratitude for the invitation to give this lecture, of course, and spend some days in the company of all this critical intelligence that you have here in Toronto. Thanks to the Center for Comparative Literature, to the Institute for Environment, Conservation and Sustainability, to Imre and Konrad and everyone else who has made this trip possible, and thank you for this incredible introduction. So the talk I am going to give today will be based on this book that Imre mentioned, the Long Heat, which has 3 parts, one on adaptation, one on carbon dioxide removal, and one on geoengineering. And it is some material from this last third part that I will draw on. Now the problem, of course, is that there's only so much you can say in about 1 hour, and the book is awfully long. It's more than 650 pages, footnotes included, so there will inevitably be a loss of facts and data and nuance here, not to mention references, and some concepts taken from the book will have to be left unexplained. I hope you can still make sense of the argument, and that I can clarify points during the discussion if needed. We have a chapter in this book called Towards a Freudo-Marxist Theory of Geoengineering that forms the basis of most of what I will say. Should anyone be interested, it contains a more detailed and comprehensive version of the argument I will outline. So in terms of theory, this will be an attempt to understand one specific emerging technology, solar geoengineering, with the help of Freudo-Marxist theory. But to make it comprehensible, I will have to spend some time on the empirical matters of the development of this technology before trying to sketch a theory of it. More precisely, this project is situated in the tradition of critical theory, the key sources being Theodor Adorno and, to a somewhat lesser extent, Herbert Marcuse, and their reception and reworking of psychoanalysis, as well as the thinking developed by the second generation of political Freudians, people like Edith Jacobson and Otto Fennikel. Old heroes like these are now having a moment in the sun. There is a resurgence of interest in radical psychoanalysis in general and the synthesis of psychoanalysis and Marxism in particular. A wave that can be seen in journals such as Parapraxis and Salvage, in the work of comrades such as Hannah Proctor and Richard Seymour, in the output of scholars ranging from Lara Sheehy to Adrian Johnston. And there is no mystery about this wave. We are living in a world marked by ever deeper political insanity. We find ourselves in a situation similar to that faced by the young scholars who created critical theory in the 1920s and 30s. Marxist political economy remains indispensable for understanding what is going on, but it is not sufficient. It has to be enriched with the theory that originates in the work of Sigmund Freud. Just look at what's been going on in the past few days when world politics to an unprecedented degree has come to revolve around the psychic needs and impulses of one individual. We seem to live in hyper-Freudian times. Which is not to say that everything is now about one person. To the contrary, we are in a conjuncture with exceedingly deep anchors in social structure. The surface phenomenon, the sheer superficiality of this one man, corresponds to an almost immeasurable structural depth. A first aspect of this conjuncture, as in the interwar period, is the rise of the far right. A second aspect is genocide. The first advanced, late capitalist genocide, a collective effort by the Euro-American dominant classes to extinguish all Palestinian life in Gaza. A third, and this will be in focus here, although I believe that all these aspects are related to one another, and I will try to gesture at some of the intersections and articulations. A third aspect is the escalating denial of the climate crisis. It reached some sort of peak so far, but I'm sure there are more peaks ahead, when the aforementioned individual spoke to the United Nations General Assembly the other week. I'll just give you some tidbits, quote, "Climate change is the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. All of these predictions made by the United Nations and many others were wrong. If you don't get away from this green scam, your country is going to fail. I love the people of Europe, and I hate to see it being devastated by energy and immigration. This double-tailed monster destroys everything in its wake. The carbon footprint is a hoax made up by people with evil intentions, and they're heading down a path of total destruction. Immigration and the high cost of so-called green renewable energy is destroying a large part of the free world and a large part of our planet. You need strong borders and traditional energy sources if you're going to be great again. Yeah. This kind of rhetoric is, of course, standard Trump fare, but what is noteworthy is that he is ratcheting up and doubling down. And what is perhaps even more remarkable is that the same kind of rhetoric is coming to dominate European politics. Europe has long been regarded as the reliable readout of sanity when it comes to climate, an antithesis of the US, where no one denies the existence of the climate crisis. But one European country after another is falling to explicit, literal climate denial of the Trumpian kind. Sweden, Germany, the UK, these are just some of the countries where far-right forces are surging and setting the political agenda and doing everything they can to reverse whatever little progress has been made on climate mitigation. I don't have the time to go into the various national details here, just to say that Trump is not an aberration. Trump is the mouthpiece of this conjuncture. The second version of Trump is the authentic representative of a moment when climate action is plunging down the agenda. Never before in recent memory has it been so downrated and downgraded and ignored as now. The order of the day, and I have been told that this goes for Canada too, is maximum extraction of fossil fuels and après moi le déluge. We are rushing across the 1.5 degree threshold and towards 2 degrees, and at no point in the past couple of decades has climate attracted so little attention. It is drowning in the din of attacks on immigrants and the elimination of the Palestinians and various forms of inter-imperialist rivalry, which does not mean, of course, that the problem as such is going away. To the contrary, escalating denial is the guarantee that climate breakdown will explode in our faces. And then something will eventually have to be done about it. We are living in what women I call the overshoot conjuncture, the period in time when the dominant classes demonstrate their constitutional inability to shut down the drivers of global warming in the face of fast approaching limits. And then this inability has to be converted into other projects for managing the fallout. So imagine that global heating is left untreated. This is easy. It is easy to picture the storm continuing to progress like it has for years now. But for how long before something larger breaks? One day it might reach a pitch of intensity that makes the inert order of capitalist society snap. People in charge could suffer a panic attack. Something has to be done immediately to get the situation under control. We can imagine the activation of some tipping point in the climate system having this effect. Perhaps an ice shelf too large to disregard breaks off, or the AMOC goes down, or the Amazon bursts into flames. Or it could be some localized event. Imagine Los Angeles is consumed by a firestorm larger than what we saw back in January. Or Miami is lost to the waves of a hurricane. Or the next flood season in Europe drowns the capital city. Any number of events can cause a fit of terror in high places. All that is needed for the heating to keep progressing, and then something will, sooner or later, create what we might call a control emergency. A control emergency would be one where dominant classes experience an imminent loss of control due to some events in the realm of climate and look around for an instrument by which to re-establish it and get back to things the way they were before. What might they find? In the warehouse of technologies for managing climate disaster, only one has a known capacity to give instant relief. Block incoming sunlight. Shoot soot into the stratosphere. Send up airplanes packed with aerosols to inject them into the air. Erect a parasol around the Earth so that less heat from the sun makes it here. Geoengineering alone can cut temperatures from practically 1 month to the next. If temperatures are rising and spiraling uncontrollably, geoengineering alone has the potential to subdue. Now, there is something about geoengineering that fits only too well into the modus operandi of 21st century capitalist society. When a crisis breaks out, it is never treated below the level of symptoms. What normally happens is that some kind of technology is rolled out to stamp the symptoms back into the ground. I'll just point to 3 cases. Whenever migrants try to cross into the EU or the US in so-called waves, the invariable response is further fortification of the borders. Bring out the patrols, the surveillance, the walls. The misery driving people onto boats and treks is, as a matter of course, never addressed. The reflexive reaction to the outbreak of COVID-19 was to conjure up a technology with immediate effect, apart from the lockdowns, a vaccine. The pandemic could have been an occasion to deal with the drivers of zoonotic spillover, notably tropical deforestation, but nothing was done to rein it in. When the chronic hyper-crisis in the Gaza Strip erupted in open conflict after the completion of the siege and the resistance fired projectiles, the immediate response was to switch on the Iron Dome, an advanced technological system for detecting and intercepting rockets in the troposphere, followed by the whole machinery of kinetic superpower for crushing the Palestinians. The occupation itself became more entrenched for every passing year. Examples of this logic could be multiplied on end. 21st century capitalist society appears constitutionally incapable of solving any problem. All it can do is to expunge symptoms. Because capitalism succeeds to excess, it keeps producing symptoms of crisis and stays unqualified for anything than their most superficial treatment. And so geoengineering is offered as a method for palliation. It has been sitting in the back of the consciousness of climate politics for some time, like an iron dome to be rolled out if the fire becomes unbearable. In 2006, Paul Crutzen published an editorial in Climatic Change that famously broke the taboo on the topic, and almost 2 decades later, the technology has now, in fact, made a leap out into the open. In the past couple of years, we have seen the first real outdoor experiments in sulfate aerosol injection. By far the most consequential of these started in early 2024. On 14th February of that year, the genocide in Gaza was in full swing. And on that day, the Wall Street Journal reported, quote, "In Israel, a startup called Stardust Solutions has begun testing a system to disperse a cloud of tiny reflective particles about 60,000 feet in altitude. It's 18 kilometers, so still within the lower reaches of the stratosphere. They are doing aerial testing of an idea called solar radiation management, also known as stratospheric aerosol injection, by basically flying really high in an airplane, releasing reflective particles," end quote. The first ever experiment of this kind. So, somewhere in the skies above historical Palestine, just as thousands of children and women and men were slaughtered on the ground as they slept in their tents or queued up for flour or ran through the dusty alleys of their camps, airplanes rose to eject soot as an exercise in geoengineering. Stardust operated behind a curtain of secrecy. The company would not disclose the composition of the proprietary articles to the Wall Street Journal, but it was talkative enough to say that the solution it brought to the world is, quote, "the only one that can lower global temperatures within a few years, 1,000 times more cost effective than any alternative," end quote. Stardust claimed to be developing the technology in anticipation of demand from governments. Its capital came from an entity called Oz Ventures. Oz Ventures was based in a tower on Menachem Begin Street in Tel Aviv, with a second office coincidentally here in Toronto. Oz Ventures ran a business accelerator to fund incipient technologies, and it had a special ace up its sleeve, quote, "The unparalleled deal flow stems from our partners and advisors' ties to the Israeli security technology ecosystem," end quote. An ecosystem of a kind centered on the Ministry of Defense and encompassing Mossad, Shin Bet, and elite technology units like 8,200. But Stardust was far from an exclusively Israeli affair. The team of Oz Ventures also included one former director of the CIA, one former director of MI5, one former associate deputy director of FBI, and Stephen J. Harper. More of the activities of Stardust came to light in September last year when Jonas Pastor released a report about it. He had made a career as the world's leading expert on the problem of governance of geoengineering. "The real challenges pertain to ethics," Pastor wrote in a paper in Science. Overshoot drove the technology to the top of the agenda. Problems then arose. Quote, "Who would control the global thermostat? Who would decide whether or not one or more actors could attempt a large-scale outdoor experiment to reflect sunlight back into space, Based on whose authority or legitimacy, using whose data, and under what conditions, end quote. Soon after writing these words, when the genocide was underway, Pasteur decided to join Stardust as a consultant, and in September last year he released his verdict in the form of a report about how this Israeli company had conducted unannounced low-altitude flights. It had designed, manufactured, and tested an engineered particle, and Pasteur considered it a success story. Stardust has made significant progress in addressing the primary technical challenges of stratospheric aerosol injection. And there was more to come. Soon his colleagues in the company would upgrade the prototype airborne dispersion system to an operational level and validate their capabilities in high-altitude aerial monitoring experiments. In the entity from which Stardust took off, only one institution could possibly supply the jets required for such tests: the Israeli Air Force. This is how the idea of geoengineering was first brought into the material world. But a long period of incubation led up to this point. Concrete techniques for manipulating the amount of incoming sunlight were studied on paper, on screen, for half a century before the first experiments. In the past 5 years, with the end of the wave of climate mobilization and the onset of the overshoot conjuncture, a number of key state apparatuses have begun to gravitate towards support for geoengineering, or at least as a necessary preamble, research into it. There have been various initiatives launched by branches of the American state, and earlier this year, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, or ARIA, of the UK government announced that it will soon conduct outdoor experiments. This ball is now rolling, and it is rolling fast. Solar geoengineering is becoming a respectable idea, The Economist happily proclaimed in 2023. And there can be little doubt about the deeper cause of this trend: the overshoot conjuncture itself, the transgression of the 1.5 degree limit, and the structural position of geoengineering in the repository of responses. An iron dome for the planet is under construction, and there is now a sense that every month of continued denial, every year of unmitigated disaster, sees another initiative for bringing it closer to deployment. The basic physics are well understood. Aerosols suspended in the sky stand in the way of rays from the sun. They scatter the incoming sunlight down to the sides and back into space. It follows that if more particles of this kind are lofted from the ground and into the atmosphere, more solar insolation will indeed be intercepted. Temperatures on Earth will fall. The most certain outcome would be global recooling, or, depending on the level of ambition, decelerated or annulled warming. Beyond this, however, not much is known. Experiments of the kind now being conducted may allow researchers to study how sulfates move in the stratosphere, but they cannot shed light on how the climate system would react to permanent large-scale injection. If one had access to several Earths, one could engineer the atmosphere of some and not others and compare the results. But unfortunately, the universe does not allow for such testing, which means that any advanced knowledge about the mechanisms of geoengineering will be theoretical. The only empirical field trial would be full implementation. Scientists are therefore left with climate models in computers and other roundabout exercises for studying at least the rough contours. Now, this research has thrown up a whole catalog of potentially catastrophic side effects of geoengineering, and here I will have to direct the interested listener to our book or some other source, but just to list some of the main concerns. Solar geoengineering would flatten the latitudinal gradients in the climate system and level the seasons, scrambling weather regimes and causing all manner of secondary chaos. Precipitation would drop, with regional droughts and desiccation. Most disconcertingly, the monsoon system on the Indian subcontinent would likely collapse. Solar panels would be starved of sunlight. The skies would take on a whiter hue. Air pollution would soar as soot drizzles down to Earth. The ozone layer would be depleted, and so on and so forth. There is no end to this list. More side effects are being discovered in model simulations every year. And as a general rule, every negative consequence of geoengineering will worsen the longer it goes on and the larger the quantities of sulfates injected. In the beginning, they may not be much of a trouble. Insofar as there are positive effects, they will come early on. After the first year of flying rounds, the accomplishments are likely to overshadow any byproducts on the horizon. But if the mission goes on, the side effects will start to kick in. There is consensus about a law of the tendency of side effects to rise. But none of these risks approach the enormity of a sudden termination. Imagine it is the year 2130 and a geoengineering operation has been going on for a century. Heat latently stored in the atmosphere has been masked by flights continuously shooting out soot. The radiative forcing of the accumulated CO2 has been cancelled out. But then something or other happens and geoengineering is abruptly terminated. The mask is ripped off, all the pent-up heat set free to do its work. This is known as the termination shock, a risk inherent in the constitution of the technology. Because aerosols naturally drift back to Earth, and insofar as their function is to undo the damage of the emissions, any interruption of the injections would set off this shock. There would be a pulse of warming as the repressed heat returns in full force. How bad could it be? If injection is called off from one year to the next, the ensuing spike in temperatures is likely to be exceedingly extreme. The heating would be several times faster than what any pre-geoengineering business as usual could achieve on its own. We are talking about average temperature on Earth jumping by perhaps half a degree per year or 4 or 5 degrees per decade, a heating so precipitous that it would have no precedent in the geological history of climate. To such a shock, no ecosystems and precious few species could adapt. Birds, fish, reptiles, mammals, none would have experienced climate dislocation at anything near this velocity. Humans would only be marginally better off. Planting crops when temperatures shoot up from one season to the next is pretty much a pointless endeavor. In a world of 3, 4, 5 degrees of warming per decade, food supplies would dwindle. Alongside nuclear winter and hothouse Earth, this is the most apocalyptic scenario known to climate science. How can we understand this with the help of theory? There is now a budding psychoanalytical literature on the climate crisis. Its foundational insights, somewhat like the equivalent of the greenhouse effect in the physical science basis, concerns denial. The progression of this crisis is constituted by denial. It originated in and is perpetuated and aggravated by denial in multifarious forms. In a powerful meditation on how it can work, Lee Zimmerman draws on the dream of the burning child reported by Freud in the interpretation of dreams. A father has been watching his feverish child's sickbed for days and nights on end until the child dies. The father then moves into the next room to a bed from which he can see the corpse lied out between tall candles. After a few hours of sleep, he, quote, dreams that the child is standing beside his bed, grasps him by the arm, and whispers to him reproachfully, "Father, don't you see I'm burning?" End quote. In Zimmerman's reading, the child's question captures the essence of the denial of the ongoing catastrophe. Don't you see that I'm burning? The red-hot child asks the father, tugging him by the arm, entreating him to open his eyes and intervene before it is too late and the body is consumed, but despairing about his willingness to do so. Is he even mentally present there at the bedside? Or has he turned away from the trauma in front of him? The essence of denial on this view is the shutting out of a reality too painful to take in. The climate catastrophe is a trauma in motion, and like the father in the eyes of his dying child, people in capitalist society respond by turning away from it. They develop a myriad of strategies for knowing what's going on and at the same time not knowing. They keep on living as usual, as though nothing deeply troubling was happening in front of their eyes, no child set on fire, and only because they behave in this fashion can the burning progress towards its end. Had they intervened in time, they could have doused the flames. Such denial is a psychic process at the level of the individual, but above all, and on this the literature is in resounding agreement, it is organized or produced by material and ideological processes distinctive to a capitalist society based on fossil fuels. Denial is not an idiosyncrasy or private pathology, but a certificate of membership in this particular society, a kind of credit card necessary for moving around in it and accessing its commodities and living without going nuts. The dream of the burning child also forms a starting point for Alenka Zupancic in her recent essay Disavowal. Like Zimmerman, she reads it in the light of the ongoing heating. Actual fires now burn across the planet. They are fueled by the central inner fire of fossil fuel combustion. From cause to symptom, fire is the element of this crisis. Closely related to denial, the mechanism of disavowal has the logic of I know well, but all the same, on the pattern of the dream of the burning child. But a different reaction was all the time possible. There is in the Freudian Ove another dream mentioned by neither Zimmerman nor Zupancic that forms a startling counterpoint to that of the burning child. It appears in perhaps the most famous or infamous case history of Dora, who tells Freud, I quote, "First dream. There is a fire in the house, said Dora. My father is standing beside my bed and wakes me up. I dress quickly. Mama wants to save her jewel box, but Papa says, I don't want to burn with both my children because of your jewel box. We hurry downstairs, and as soon as I am out of the house, I wake up." End quote. The unconscious of the fossil fuel era emerges into visibility. Dora had a vision of what could be done to get out in time. The jewels in the box are the assets that must be stranded, the capital sacrificed so that people may live. The latent content of her dream was the picture of responsible intervention in the moment of danger, executed by a subject who would rather let go of jewels than see everyone, children included, burned to death. We then have two models for behavior in the moment of crisis, delineated unconsciously by Freud, and there is no doubt which of the two capitalist society has elected to follow. One driver of denial, one of many, is a sense of omnipotence. A sense of omnipotence that generates a refusal to acknowledge an external world that belies it through limits. Sally Waintraub, a pioneer of psychoanalytical climate studies, has emphasized this factor. People on top of the pile cannot own up to a crisis resolvable only by them stepping down, and so, quote, they live in a bubble-like psychic retreat from reality. End quote. To those who feel entitled to the gifts of the fossil economy, the full reality of climate breakdown is anathema. There is in this type of denial a callousness, or as Adorno would have it, a coldness, the basic principle of bourgeois subjectivity. This is Adorno's words. The father as cold onlooker. Dominant classes have, of course, a renowned capacity to turn on the blindness of the seeing eye, Freud, when faced with the suffering that they themselves cause. Indeed, as Henrike Kopais argues in an elaboration on Adorno in her just published book, Bourgeois Coldness, this is the effective technology constituting the bourgeois subject since the time of slavery. A ubiquitous technique for withdrawal, distance, and targeted disengagement, for sustained social indifference, for the refusal or incapacity to be susceptible to suffering. These are her words. Without which capitalist society would simply cease to function. The bourgeois subject has had to ignore generations of burning children to maintain ownership of the earth. He would rather consign children than jewels to the blaze. To this venerable disposition has been added the conjunctural aspect of a genocide. In many respects, this has been a genocide unlike any other, notably a genocide live-streamed for everyone to see, documented in real time, available for ocular inspection at the tap of a screen. In the words of Gabor Mate, whom some of you might know, himself a Holocaust survivor, it's like we're watching Auschwitz on TikTok. Had there been YouTube and Instagram and TikTok around Auschwitz, this is what we would have seen: people burning alive. End quote. The Gaza genocide has brought the scenario of the burning child to a new level of literal confirmation, when children, systematically targeted as such, have actually burned to death in full view of people comfortably reposing in the next room, located one step to the north. Don't you see that the children are burning? Subjects of power in the northern room have responded by turning on the blindness of the seeing eye, denying that a genocide is taking place, while supplying every kind of ammunition required for executing it. The effects are bound to be felt by others than the people here singled out for destruction. In its peculiar constitution, the Gaza genocide has marked a step change in the normalization of the burning of children and other innocents in the global south. Denial, as the mask of complicity, has been distributed more widely and densely than ever before, and it will be worn in other contexts, Plenty of observers have had the sense that Gaza has broken a limit with repercussions at the species level. Among them, Isabella Hamad, writing in early 2024, quote, "Somewhere recently, humanity seems to have crossed an invisible line, and on this side, naked power combined with a will to profit threaten to overwhelm the collective interests of our species," end quote. The same psychopolitics is then applied to the reality of global heating. The bourgeois subject puts its well-honed and recently updated effective technology to work and re-enters a state of denial. If this is a mechanism defending against a trauma, it would be the trauma of losing fossilized privilege, of acid stranding, or capital destruction, as women I theorize it in Overshoot. In short, the forfeiture of the jewels. There is a fairly famous photograph that you might have seen that I think deserves iconic status, depicting three golfers, calm and composed to all appearances, putting while the hillside behind them is aglow with fire. Have some of you seen this picture? Yeah. It was taken during the 2017 wildfire season in the Pacific Northwest. The shot unsubtly capturing the bubble-like retreat from reality as it approaches bursting point. Should we pack away our golf clubs just because the world around us is burning? A talk show host at a Canadian golf program chose these words to accompany the picture, quote, "So many natural disasters, poor people in Houston, poor people in Florida. It also continues in Oregon and the west coast of Canada, the wildfires. And look at these guys. They are finishing their round, maybe 600 or 700 yards away from this fire. They have to be absolutely insane," end quote. But it is an insanity that rarely raises eyebrows, a psychopathology at one with life as such for the dominant classes. It became spectacular in that golf photo because it was caught in a moment at once overly typical and untypical. By far the more common case is that fire rages at a distance. The burning child typically resides in the global south and can be regarded from a safe room, noticed, neglected, forgotten, without risk. But in the Overshoot conjuncture, those children will multiply and the burning come closer. In June of last year, 24 people attending a rally for Donald Trump in Las Vegas required medical treatment because of the searing heat. From the stage, the presidential candidate noted that, quote, "It's 110 Fahrenheit, but it doesn't feel it to me," end quote, and kept turning up climate denialism and fossil fuel chauvinism to levels higher than in his first campaign. Playing golf while the hills burn, metaphorically or literally, looks set to become an ever more common practice, the bourgeois subject working overtime to keep its coldness in the heat and uphold denial. This is the thrust of the offensive that we've been seeing in the second Trump presidency. Denial as aggressive praxis and ideology, such as in the concerted attacks on basic climate research, eyes actively closed, curtains drawn before the sight of the burning child, the man putting the cords to golfing president himself. But again, Trump is only the high priest of a society-wide psychopathology of everyday life, to quote Adorno. In the minds of the subjects, a bourgeois society will choose total destruction, its objective potential, rather than rise to reflections that would threaten its basic strata. End quote. Denial is a structural condition in a capitalist society making its way towards unmitigated breakdown. The literal denialism of the far right is the crystallization of this condition, but denial encompasses a much wider set of practices than presidents and their crowds hooting about hoaxes and frauds. We can here follow the taxonomy of denial developed by Stanley Cohen in his classic States of Denial, knowing about atrocities and suffering, based, coincidentally, on his studies of how the Israeli public denied mass torture and other forms of oppression during the First Intifada. And this taxonomy has been compellingly applied to both the Gaza genocide and the climate crisis. Apart from literal denial, there is interpretive denial, as in, climate change exists, but it isn't much of a problem. More universal still is implicatory denial. Here the father does not say anything to deny or downplay the fact that the child is burning. He merely acts as if it were not the case, standing there beside the bed, his attention focused elsewhere. Perhaps he just goes about his day. Maybe he occasionally fiddles with some air conditioner. He might give the child a painkiller, but under no circumstances will he initiate the capital destruction that alone can stop the burning from continuing to its end. And then there comes a point when denial shades into repression. Indeed, the two mechanisms are so close and functionally interrelated as to be indistinguishable in at least some versions of Freudian theory. Both blot out something disagreeable. Both straddle the borderline, never a sharply drawn one, between the normal and the pathological. Freud. The relation between denial and repression can be conceptualized in a number of ways, none of which has won the consensus of psychoanalysts. One fertile attempt was made by Edith Jacobson. She belonged to the second political generation of psychoanalysts. Based in Berlin during the Weimar years, they were animated by a faith in the affinity between psychoanalysis and Marxism, moved in communist circles, offered therapy to the proletariat, and fought the onrushing catastrophe. If they had a theoretical lodestar, it was that psychic processes are subject to the vagaries of history. And one of their most brilliant minds was Jacobson, author of perhaps the clearest attempt to parse the relation between denial and repression. For her, denial works on a broad, global canvas, whereas repression has more of a laser focus. Most significant for our purposes, there is a chronological and causal relation between the two, I quote. Clinical observations leave no doubt that denial is a more archaic, more primitive, and historically earlier mechanism than repression. In fact, it's forerunner. Denial will normally prepare and assist repression, end quote. So repression succeeds denial in the struggle against reality and lends it finer precision. It is because denial has ruptured the relation between ego and reality that repression comes into play as a successor, a more diligent executioner of the task. Or denial is a spontaneous drift away from the disagreeable, while repression sets up a more stable apparatus to screen it out. While these distinctions have not been unanimously accepted in psychoanalytical theory, the basics of repression are not in much dispute. And here we might return to the founding father. The essence of repression lies simply in turning something away and keeping it at a distance from the conscious, writes Freud, immediately suggesting an overlap with denial. Repression is all about keeping something unpleasant tucked away, out of sight, under the lid. We can then hazard the proposition that geoengineering would represent a materialized and institutionalized repression of the climate crisis. It all begins with a moment of danger. The ego guards against this danger by repression. Called forth by a drive internal to the ego, some menace is breathing down its neck. There has arisen a clash between drive and reality that is dangerous to the ego, who reacts by freeing itself from the contradiction through an act of fleeing or flying away. Repression, Freud stresses, is an attempt at flight. And one is here tempted to see the aviation technology of geoengineering literally fulfilling the scenario. In his characteristic blend of psychology and thermodynamics, Freud conceives of the drive as a quantum of psychic energy pushing against the surrounding world, and when the energy reaches a certain level of intensity, the conflict becomes active, and precisely this activation elicits repression. We recognize here the control emergency and the decision to deploy. This is the moment when the flames from the child have leapt onto the clothes of the father, or when the wildfires enter the lawn and the grass itself starts burning. Now something else has to be done. To endure, denial must make the leap into repression. But the repressed energy does not thereby go out of existence. Rather, it stays active down below, bubbling, simmering, exerting unrelenting pressure on the forces above, seeking to break through the lid and discharge itself. Quote, "We should not think of the process of repression as a single event with permanent results, as when, say, a living thing is killed and from then on remains dead. Repression demands rather a constant expenditure of energy and would be undermined if this were relaxed." End quote, from Freud. Maintaining the equilibrium requires an equally unrelenting counter-pressure in an unending conflict. End quote. The injections must not cease. Sulfate aerosols would have to be transported into the stratosphere around the clock. Repression is a long-term commitment. Meanwhile, in this overheated cauldron, the energy, indestructible by definition, must find other outlets. They can appear far removed from the original source. The negated energy succeeds in getting its way by certain roundabout paths, Freud writes, but not without submitting to some distortions. Here come the side effects: the fractured regional climates, the lacking rainfall, the diffuse sunlight, the white sky, and all the far-fetched rest. The repressed material proliferates in the dark, so to speak, and find extreme forms of expression, remote derivatives that can take the subject and those around her by surprise. They too must be dammed up through new rounds of repression, But in the end, all of this, of course, is in vain. Quote, "A ceaseless struggle is being waged against the repressed, in which the repressing forces steadily lose ground." End quote. Ultimately, the defenses fail. The more heavily the dam is reinforced, the greater the pressure, until there is the inevitable return of the repressed. And of this, science knows no better picture than the termination shock. The return of the repressed takes place at the fearful turning points of history, notes Marcuse. And the research has described in some detail what it would look like. Geoengineering does not address the causes of global warming. It represses it exclusively and literally. It maps nearly perfectly onto the Freudian model of repression, but the point is not merely the formal resemblance or isomorphism. Rather, geoengineering should be seen as a substantive instance of repression by dint of its functional relation to denial. Capitalist society will have moved all the way into the control emergency on the psychic fuel of denial, which beyond that point must enter into the engines of the sulfate planes. The sole way for it to persist henceforth is to flip into repression. Geoengineering is the single available measure by which this society can convince itself potentially that the fire is not happening even after it has become unignorable. There is no other practical proposition for the long-term survival of denial, and denial resists its own end. Or, following Jacobson's temporal and dialectical schema, we can say that if geoengineering follows next, it will happen only because the prior phase has laid down the tracks for it. So strong as to drive society into the emergency, denial will also determine the technology for treating its symptoms. Denial is the forerunner, in Jacobson's words, preparing and assisting in initiating the higher phase of repression with its finer precision and more stable apparatus. Precisely because it is this fuel that has taken society so deep into the conflagration, we should expect its energies to flow over into the emergency response and upgrade themselves into an unrelenting effort to keep the heating at a distance. If we accept the finding that denial is constitutive of the climate crisis, we must also anticipate that it will impregnate geoengineering, which would be merely a continuation, a transmutation of the processes that have brought the catastrophe about. If the control emergency is the eye of a needle for denial, it and the rich man can enter only by actually suppressing climate change through technologies that make up means of repression. Now, since this is supposed to be a lecture in literary theory, I should perhaps relay our one model from literature for this kind of repression and the symptom formation it produces, namely Macbeth, where Lady Macbeth obsessively washes her hands to remove the stain of blood from various murders. But I will leave it out for reasons of time. It's in the book, and instead move to another psychic aspect of geoengineering. In recent years, the familiar faces of digital and financial capital, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Dustin Moskowitz, and others, the meta-entrepreneurs, as Comrade Imre calls them, have thrown their weight behind this technology with such zest as to prompt Time to run a piece in 2023 on, quote, "Why billionaires are obsessed with blocking out the sun," end quote. The magazine took a sneak peek into the souls of such men. Addressing climate change, it noted, is going to take a truly gargantuan global effort. There will have to be, quote, "fundamental changes around what and how we consume, and understanding that society can't simply exist as a project to extract ever greater quantities of resources without eventually hitting some sort of wall. If your life story involved working really hard on some stuff in your 20s, and then it is paying off so substantially that you're able to spend the rest of your life working on passion projects while everyone around you tells you what an awesome, cool genius you are, you're probably not, on a fundamental level, too excited about some sort of society-level change. In your experience, things have worked out really well, so therefore the thing we've got going right now is probably pretty good. But also this climate change stuff is definitively not good. What to do? Solar geoengineering can seem like an answer to that question. End quote. With this paragraph, the #1 mainstream magazine outlined the rudiments of a Freudo-Marxist theory of geoengineering. This technology speaks to the psychic needs of the dominant classes. The sharp limits in the climate system and the infinite drives of capital accumulation are locked in absolute contradiction, because members of the dominant classes have a deep libidinal investment In the drives, they will favor a technique for managing the climate that does not require them to be restrained or relinquished. Even the casual American reader of news stories can see the intuitive appeal of this theory. If we want to dig a little bit deeper, we can turn to the original Freudian theory of fetishism. Freud wondered why some people value their sexual fetishes so highly, and his answer came from the penis. More precisely, Freud imagined a little boy who discovers his mother's genitals for the first time. There's no penis there. The sight of the missing penis fills the boy with dread, because it seems to imply that his own prized member could be cut off. This thought is too much to bear. To absorb the perception of the absent phallus without succumbing to a paralyzing fear, the boy seizes upon some other object, becomes smitten by it, and charges it with enduring libidinal energy. A fetish has arisen like a phoenix from the horror of castration. It protects the boy from the possibility and assures him that the penis is still there, relieving him from the implications of what he has seen. The data of the female anatomy do not have to be fully denied, merely disavowed, half accepted, half rejected, thanks to the investment in the fetish. It attains immeasurable value. This would seem to be Freud at his cookiest and corniest. The evidence for boys reacting with such fright the first time they spot their mother's vaginas is apocryphal, to say the least. Phallic monism, both sexes defined by the male organ, in its presence or absence, has its fairly widely known problems. In States of Denial, Cohen acknowledges this particular Freudian theory as the source of modern thinking about denial, only to ridicule it as hopelessly gnostic and obscure. Yet shorn of literalism, it might hold another key to the psychology of geoengineering. Wim and I have argued that fear of capital destruction is a form of castration anxiety. In the reality of climate breakdown, the bourgeois subject discerns the specter of losing his most valuable objects. Geoengineering arises as, to quote Freud again, a token of triumph over the threat of castration and a protection against it. Along the lines described by Freud, it becomes a fetish, a highly valued compromise solution, enabling the subject to register the grim situation while keeping his objects intact. The ego has been split in two, one part accurately perceiving how bad the heating is, the other refusing to sacrifice value to this reality. And to sustain the refusal, quote, he takes hold of something else instead, a part of the body or some other object, and assigns it the role of the penis, which he cannot do without, end quote. Qua fetish, geoengineering would inherit much of the cathexis originally belonging to the capital, particularly the fixed capital, whose destruction mitigation would mandate. Because it would save the penis in the moment of danger, it would become a second penis, valued like the first and then some. Abstruse as some of this might seem, it is part of a Freudo-Marxist theory, intuitively graspable by outlets like Time. Because billionaires hate the idea of losing capital, they will transfer their passions to geoengineering. It could become a fixation, and such reallocation of cathexis has been foreshadowed in texts written long before any deployment. In The Planet Remade, How Geoengineering Could Change the World, Oliver Morton, an editor at The Economist responsible for its advocacy of the technology, points out that facilities for digging up and burning fossil fuels represent a lot of fixed capital. Investments of such size deserve respect. Quote, fossil fuels are built into the foundations of the industrial and economic system, which means cutting, the mere verb suggesting castration, which means cutting emissions is hard, especially so since the costs of the cuts are concentrated on a powerful sector of the economy, end quote. Fondle the power and bring on the planes. These have the advantage of attracting, quote, the interest and admiration of wealthier and more powerful men, men of human empire, men whom Morton himself admires, the meta-entrepreneurs, above all Bill Gates. The attraction has connotations not so difficult to detect. Quote, some see a beauty in these new forms of engineering, the grandeur of holding back great sheets of ice and rerouting planet-spanning currents of air thrills them, writes Morton, who counts himself among their number. He outlines the pro-geoengineering argument from beauty. We should take pleasure in the planes. I could give other examples, and indeed would do so in the book. If this is the kind of cathexis channeled into the planes before they have started flying, one can imagine its amount after takeoff. Friends of geoengineering would hear squirm and protest, but this is not how humans relate to their machines. They do it with reason. They employ their cool and clear minds. Such an objection would betray how little they know about human beings, particularly human beings who have created this climate catastrophe. More to the point would be the quip by Adorno: in psychoanalysis, nothing is true except the exaggerations. When it comes to the sulfate plane, it really does have an anatomical likeness to the penis. One reason why men, and it nearly always is men, rich white men who study and sponsor and support geoengineering, one reason they are so fond of this technology might be its manner of ejaculating sulfur out of a tube. It joins philanthropy with pornography, the world saved by a perpetual cum shot. This would not be the first time men fetishize a machine phallus, but it would produce dangers only the atomic bomb has approached. The bomb, however, exists mostly in a state of dormancy, with only 2 exceptions from 1945 so far. Sulfate planes would have to fly around the clock, providing so much more surface for cathexis. Is it okay if I go on for another 5 minutes? If fetishism denotes one additional layer in the psychology of geoengineering, repression remains its seedbed. Here is a technology for waging war against reality. Insofar as it develops a fetish character, it stems from this belligerence. And I quote Freud again. The creation of the fetish was due to an intention to destroy the evidence for the possibility of castration so that fear of castration could be avoided. But this is not to say that geoengineering is irrational through and through. It does not renounce and repudiate reality in all its forms. Rather, it displays a very keen sense of reality in some respects. Otherwise, it wouldn't have a chance of working as a technology. Consider this passage from Wake Smith, an aviation engineer and one of the leading scholars of geoengineering, who describes the modification of existing airplanes required for the mission. Quote, "The high bypass engines installed on current production airliners with big front-end fans that route most of the air around the engine core rather than through it, operate very poorly above 15 kilometers. So Sail 01, the sulfate planes to be constructed, he calls them Sail 01, would utilize medium bypass engines such as the F1118 GE101 high-altitude turbo fan. The engines would be mounted on 4 pylon nacelles on the wings, an inboard twin pod, 2 engines, and a mid-span single pod." However much it might sound like it to the uninitiated, and I'm certainly one of them, this is not a fever dream or the raving of the mad. These sentences are written in hyper-rational code in the style of a manual that tells the reader how to use a machine. Geoengineering research is intensely preoccupied with the material properties of the world, the size of aerosols, the density and dispersal of plumes, the chemical reactions between particles. It seeks a path through thick clouds of stubborn realities, a method that would take it securely to the goal. It scans the shelves for the best precursors, engines, wings, points of injection, and other items to be assembled into the most efficient possible hardware. This is the rationale of the outer experiments of Stardust and soon the Aria and others to come. There are no difficulties in categorizing this rationality. It is instrumental. The concern is with the means. These must be optimized so as to provide the shortest road to the fixed and set end. Presumptive geoengineers seek, in the words of Marcuse, the handling of matter as the mere stuff of control, making their way in the world conceived as a design problem. But there is something about this progress that turns it blind. The geoengineers do not rise to reflections on the direction and drift of society as a whole. They do not ask, to once again quote Adorno, the question of how to establish a form of society itself in which the possibility of such catastrophes would be excluded. End quote. They merely look down at what they have on the desk in front of them. Because a higher perspective is missing, rationality regresses to a constricted obsession with technology. Adorno speaks of an infantile and repressed behavior similar to that of a child which cannot rest until the clock has been opened up and it can see how the little cogs work inside it. And such micro-rationality is the only kind on offer when the question of the purpose of society has been taken off the table. Worse still, it equips the central blindness with better instruments.
An instrumental rationality in the employ of an irrational whole will arm it so that, quote from Adorno, every example of progress in any concrete particular case also immediately takes on a threatening and terrifying character, end quote. Probably for this reason, high-altitude turbofans and 4-pilot nacelles do not sound particularly soothing. The end result of a society that tries to manage every problem, every crisis with a fresh batch of technologies is a hardened invasion force for the domination of nature. Marching over field after field, it reinforces existing property relations to the same degree as it tries to subjugate one more residue of autonomous nature. As in Gaza, relations of domination are defended through the deployment of technological force for the suppression of their own symptoms. As in Gaza, continuous deployment of fighter jets and other instruments for kinetic superpower might work perfectly well on their own instrumental terms, but what they produce is catastrophe on an ever greater scale, a war on reality that ends in utter destruction. In the case of geoengineering, with the return of the repressed heat in the termination shock. And Wim and I argue that if geoengineering actually does get underway, it will most probably end in precisely such a shock. I don't have the time here to lay out the reasons for why this is the likely outcome. I refer again to the book. Suffice it to say that the picture of geoengineering we are served by the research so far is a picture of repressed heat. And as everyone who has read some Freud knows, what is repressed does have a tendency to return with a vengeance. So, engineers like Wake Smith and the people of Stardust are paving the way for the leap from denial to repression. And it is fairly easy to imagine someone like Trump coming to the point of making that leap. It would not compel him to revise his literal denial. He would merely need to tweet that it has now actually become too hot up here on stage for reasons unknown and unrelated to my buddies in the oil companies or to clean beautiful coal. But thankfully, we have a fine technology that can sort it all out. And no sooner had Trump been reinstalled this year than speculations set off. Will he do it this time? Writing in The Conversation in February, 2 British champions of geoengineering welcomed the scenario. The progression of the heating as such increased its probability. Quote, extreme weather will become harder to ignore. Trump could, of course, downplay any link to climate change, but there's a chance this might trigger him to decide emergency action is required. After all, Trump is close to certain tech figures who like big technological solutions to global problems. He likes to act fast and is prepared to deal with democratic reactions later. In those circumstances, he might feel that we should do whatever it takes to deploy new climate-saving strategies at speed, end quote. With enough spurs from wildfires or hurricanes, these 2 researchers concluded the 47th president may well instruct Pentagon to load its fighter jets. Richard Haas, an elder of the US foreign policy establishment, likewise looked forward to geoengineering now having its moment. With Trump back in power, the silly illusion of a transition was finally punctured. Quote, fossil fuels will be here for decades to come. The good news, though, is that a range of potential initiatives that are consistent with the Trump administration's priorities could still slow climate change, end quote. Above all, the sulfate planes, which would not collide with a car accelerating out from the White House. Here is a way he can act on it, Haas wrote. But this is not a question of Trump, once again, as an individual. Perhaps it will rather be the 48th or the 50th president who will do it. Anyone of a similar bent taking the helm at an even later stage of warming would be still more prone to geoengineering. I'm almost done. If denial is the psychic crude of this crisis, repression is becoming the high-octane jet fuel. But this raises some general questions regarding the psychic life of technology. And here we might quote Marx for a change, one of his most classical statements about the differentia specifica of human technology. A spider conducts operations which resemble those of the weaver, and a bee would put many an architect to shame by the construction of its honeycombed cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect builds the cell in his mind before he erects it in reality, end quote. So a human technology is incubated in the mind, potentially for a very long time before it enters material reality. This opens up for the influx of psychic processes into its constitution. Because productive forces are first conceived in the mind, there is ample time for them to be shaped by what goes on there. The bourgeois subject, the men who own and control the means of production, can sire forces born with the mark of its inner dysfunctions. Such a Freudo-Marxist theory of technology would be concrete and conjunctural, A little bit different from the best-known essay in that tradition, Eros and Civilization. There, Marcuse suggests that thanatos, or the death drive, provides the psychic fuel for technological development. An instinct for destruction is extroverted and applied to nature, which humans have been, for millennia, hacking up, reassembling, slaughtering, trying to control. The hypothesis is sweepingly formulated for all of civilization. A more granular theory, true to the historicist bent in Marx, would rather look for the psychic contradictions of particular conjunctures and how these are displaced into emergent technologies. Repression, in other words, is not a trans-historical determinant of productive forces. It is merely the defense mechanism called forth by the overshoot conjuncture. In the spirit of the second generation of political Freudians, and indeed all the best political psychoanalysis from Adorno to Fanon, we should insist on the historical specificity of psychic life. We should resist attempts to explain climate breakdown with timeless complexes or drives, and likewise with the technologies for treating the symptoms of global warming. These cannot possibly have arisen as a result of phenomena always and everywhere present in the psyche. Otto Fennekel offers the following synoptic formulation for a conjunctural Freudo-Marxist theory of technology. Quote, "Let us think of an invention with a practical and at the same time a sexual symbolic value. For example, a Zeppelin airship, which is certainly a sexual symbol, but on which people can also fly. In order to understand inventions, we must not overlook the rational necessity which must be present before an invention can result, and which arises only in a certain social situation. The task which is imposed in reality can evidently be completed with the help of instinctual drives. Indeed, it can only be performed with the aid of a certain instinctual structure." End quote. Substitute the Salford planes for the Zeppelins, and we get the following. An invention of such a kind can only come about in a highly determinate situation. A rational necessity, the control emergency, puts the novel productive force in orbit. But the task is completed with the help of instinctual drives, possibly culminating in the quasi-sexual fetishization of the plane, certainly beginning with the lust for profit. Moreover, the emergency is the result of the previous work of that same lust as it clashes with biophysical reality. Geoengineering would give it extended reign, or in schematic terms, capitalist property relations elevate the drive to amass wealth into the engine of the social order. When this drive collides with the climate system, denial is the paramount response. In the moment of emergency, means of repression are rolled out, and they have a haunting psychopathology in them. In the current moment, this schema remains theoretical, hypothetical. The hard reality of a geoengineered planet is still in the future. One must hope that it never comes to pass. If it never does, however, geoengineering nonetheless reveals something about the psychic makeup of the white male bourgeois subject in the early 21st century. Oddly, it represents a fantasy of repression, a yearning for the impacts of climate breakdown to be undone by technological means. We here have the opportunity to study psychic processes feeding into a technology in statu nascendi. Considered from this angle, geoengineering, if only as a scientific template, issues from and partakes in the psychic state of deep cultural anxiety about the future for the planet and for humans, in the words of E.M. Kaplan, or, of Adorno again, the dizziness that overcomes a society threatened by total destruction. There really seems to be a ghost in the machine this time. If we accept the insight that the progression of the climate crisis is constituted by denial, psychology really ought to have an authoritative position in research on geoengineering. In Adorno's words, the realm specific to psychology is the realm of irrationality. And the climate crisis is a journey ever deeper into that realm. Insofar as reality is determined by irrational forces, positing a rational world means departing from that reality, while thereby also sinking headlong into it. Truly rational research on geoengineering would zoom in on the irrational. Truly rational behavior, and this as in Marcuse's age, would mean, in his words, the refusal to go along and the effort to do away with the conditions which produce the insanity. End quote. Reason is refusal and reason is resistance. Thank you. sorry I went so much over time. I had miscalculated earlier.
No, you're good. You can feed your own questions, right? I mean...
First off, thank you so much for coming and sharing all your insights with us today. I work as a psychotherapist with not the President of the United States, but regular, ordinary people that don't have the privilege of being able to retreat into a denial model, and facts are very sharp, and you can see the ecological cliff and social cliff, etc., that we're all heading towards. And they're pretty consistently coming up with this feeling of being overwhelmed and powerless. I'm wondering if you could speak to that so-called impotence and what, I mean, all of us here can do.
Good question. Well, just to say that there was this went for all the time, but I still omitted a lot of things. One being this feeling of powerlessness as another source of denial. So denial can develop at the top of the pile, but also at the bottom. There's a kind of subaltern denial that stems from the feeling of powerlessness. This is the father in front of the burning child, fundamentally feeling, I can't do anything about this. And this is the trauma. This is too painful to take in, so I shut out this reality and I deny it. And I think a lot of people are practicing various forms of denial for this reason. Not necessarily that they're so privileged in this world, but that they feel completely powerless to do anything about it. And then, of course, there are all sorts of scales in between. And I mean, the feeling of despair is, I'm sure, something that we struggle with, all of us, most of us. And it's a very tough psychic burden to bear in these times. I don't know if I have a recipe for how to get out of it. My recipe used to be collective action, like go to a climate camp and occupy a coal-fired power plant and feel the rush of collective power that breaks out of the despair, at least temporarily. This is kind of an injection. I think I describe it as in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, that you could take regularly to get out of despair. But these days, there isn't that much collective action happening on the climate front, because we're in the conjunction that I described. So I, at least, can't really take these injections very often. You could say the same things about the genocide that have been going on for 2 years. I mean, who knows if it's now coming to an end? It's a whole other debate, where a lot of people have felt this complete despair as well, just seeing this going on, you know, literally seeing the burning children and feeling, I can't do anything about this. But when you go out with others on the streets and maybe you can achieve some small tactical victories, you can combat that despair. Okay, I'm going to share this. Okay, let's see. Yes.
All right, I'll help you.
Yes, please.
So you're in the home of AI optimism here in Toronto. And I'm not an AI optimist. In fact, it's not AI, it's IA, it's information automation, really. My question is, when the machines tell us how to behave rationally in the face of climate crisis, what will be the response and how will the same story play out or be changed?
Okay, yeah, this is a good question that you're asking to the wrong person, because I don't know anything about AI. Actually, just today I ordered my first book about AI, which is this one that just came out that is called If Anyone Builds This, Everyone Dies. Have you seen this book? Anyone seen this book?
I would recommend Empire of AI as well, by Karen Howe. The machines are supposed to tell us how to behave rationally.
Yeah. But there is clearly a point where AI and geoengineering come together and seem, you know, to have some kind of natural affinity. And I've been discussing this a little bit with my close comrade Jacob Blumenfeld, who is a bit of an expert on Gunther Anders, who is now finally receiving attention in Anglophone academia as well. His book, The Obsolescence of the Human, is, I think, just about to come out in English translation for the first time. And his theory of technology, which according to Jacob makes Adorno seems like a happy and optimistic guy, is based on the nuclear bomb as the paradigm, but it's this whole idea that the technology is making the human being obsolete, which is precisely what you can feel about AI And if it's combined with geoengineering, even more so. So Jacob has written a little about, he has this article that came out some time ago called Welcome to the Anderscene. So Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and then now also we have Gunther Anderscene, where he writes about AI and geoengineering as kind of fulfilling the scenario of others. Yeah. But I don't have any particular insights into AI to share.
Thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering if I could just invite you to reflect a little bit on the status of proletarian subjectivity. I appreciated throughout the talk the focus on bourgeois subjectivity as sort of the key thrust of this, and then for a while I felt this sort of conflation between the bourgeois subjectivity and the social subjectivity, or the social system itself, which at the end of your talk I think you resolved nicely by pointing towards the contradictions that emerge within a psychoanalytical account of subjectivity. But is proletarian subjectivity merely a contradiction of bourgeois subjectivity on this account, or is it an autonomous subjectivity? And then we could think about the ways in which we might explicate other accounts of the current crisis in this conjuncture that aren't merely repression, but are things like projection or perhaps even deflection as part of what's at stake. That the reason why we failed to end the genocide is X, Y, Z in power, rather than our own lack of constituted power as a class that could actually exercise its power as a class.
Yeah, well, this is a very good and big question. I think, well, one take on this would be one sketched by Adorno, which is that the working class is fully integrated in capitalist society, and proletarian subjectivity has become tied to fossil fuels as much as bourgeois subjectivity, almost. He writes in one of his lecture books that the working class nowadays doesn't only have its chains to lose, it has its motorbikes and its cars to lose as well. This he wrote obviously before anyone could be aware of the climate crisis. But it means that there is a libidinal investment at a psychic level from a lot of working class people in fossil fuel technologies as well. This is one of the reasons for support from working class constituencies for far-right anti-climate politics in the global north. We can't deny that there are working class people who vote for these parties and who feel they want to defend their cars and their motorbikes or whatever it is against these green people who want to castrate us. Does this mean that proletarian subjectivity as such is done and over forever? I don't think so. Why? Because it can pop up in the most unexpected circumstances. I would point to Italy over the past few weeks, where we've had this surprising, really, no one could have predicted it, this surge of working class action in support of the Palestinians. I mean, a general strike called by the largest trade union federation in an advanced capitalist country for Palestine is something unheard of in the history of Palestine, but also I think in the history of modern working class politics. Did that have any role in tipping the scale towards the ceasefire? I mean, we don't know. It's maybe something for historians to disentangle if this ceasefire holds. But at least it shows us that you can actually have mass scale working class politics in a country like Italy, where no one thought that it would come back.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. I have a question about the framing of the sympathy with psychoanalysis. I'm hearing the talk as exactly anti-psychoanalytic, and what I mean by that is that it doesn't seem to tolerate the unconscious as unconscious. In the dream of the burning child, Freud is clear that the child has died prior to the dream, prior to the father falling asleep. And in Lacan and Japanships, when they read the dream, for them, the talking burning child, and the talking is important, is the encounter with the real, but it's not a reality that can be located in language. It's the real which disrupts language. And the disavowal is in waking up and thinking that one has actually acquired insight. And so the father starts treating the death of the child and loss and grief, which are enormous, as empirical, right? Things that can be managed through the placement of the corpse and the placement of the candle and the relationship between the candle and the corpse. So it just seems like the position that the talk is taking is that of the father, actually, which is the position that the talk is also admonishing. And so if we have this system where the point of the unconscious is to provide insights, which is to see to be folded into the conscious mind, and the point of the drives is to be better aligned with our desires, then we have a position that psychoanalysis thinks of as psychosis, but you're talking about that as rationality, right? Like, so how do you reconcile that the model of rationality that you're proposing is also a model that psychoanalysts might think of as a psychotic trait, and therefore like the end of neurosis?
Well, my understanding of psychosis would be, for instance, in line with what Sally Weintraub argues in her book, that psychosis is fundamentally constituted by departure from reality. And this is, of course, what Freud says as well, that both psychosis and neurosis are fundamentally departures from reality in different forms. So what she argues in her book, The Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, is that we are living in a fundamentally psychotic society that has departed from the reality of the climate crisis. Insisting on that reality is the opposite of psychosis. Now, for the Lacanian stuff in your intervention, I don't know Lacanian theory. I'll be honest about this. The little I've read about Lacan strikes me as very underwhelming and confusing. And the kind of psychoanalytical theory that I personally appreciate is the one that is associated with critical theory and the second generation. So, in a way, a more orthodox political Freudianism. And as for the unconscious in these dreams, well, one of the arguments we make in reading these dreams, and I've sketched it somewhere else, actually in a paper on literature, maybe the only one that I wrote on literature, is that you can argue that in the climate crisis, there is a kind of a material unconscious that can be seen, that becomes legible for the first time. And that, so I did this when reading Racine kind of Fanny's Men in the Sun and some Conrad stories, and argue that, against classical interpretations of kind of Fanny's Men in the Sun as focusing on actual castration, sexual stuff. And the same with this Dora dream, where she tells Freud this dream that she has about waking up in the burning house. Then Freud says, well, this is you actually having a dream about wetting yourself in the bed, and this is relating to your masturbation and your sexual experiences. And Dora sighs and said, oh, I knew that you were going to say that. And this has, given rise to the whole feminist controversy around this particular case study and the feminist critique of how Freud behaves in relation to Dora in this clinical setting. And we can now side with Dora and say that this dream has nothing to do with sex. The real unconscious Latin material here has to do with fire as such. And she describes this dream coming out of an actual experience of going on a vacation in a hut, in a cabin with her family, and there being an actual fire. And this is what she's processing in her dream. So we can side with Dora against Freud and say that the material content that is rising from the unconscious here, that we can now see, has to do with nature. It doesn't have to do with her sexual experiences necessarily.
Oh, yes, you. And then
this may be addressing the rest of the book, but I think stratospheric aerosol injection is one extreme of many geoengineering. That definitely seems to be under the purview of meta-entrepreneurs right now, but there's, as I understand it, a number of geoengineering varying in intensity and globality. I just wanted to ask about how you see geoengineering figuring in the psychic of a eco-socialist futurity, because many of the projections for how we get out of climate crisis involve some degree of geoengineering, albeit with more local structures. But yeah, how would you think about the psychic role of these various different types of geoengineering in eco-socialism?
Yeah, so there are, of course, some people who try to advocate geoengineering from a progressive position, from a left standpoint. Holly Jean Buck, my former student and maybe the leading social scientist in geoengineering studies, she takes this line. Kim Stanley Robinson takes this line in the Ministry for the Future. We argue in our book that there might be ways of using carbon dioxide removal for progressive and emancipatory ends, possibly on limited scales, but we don't see any kind of left case for geoengineering that is credible, because the technology is, as such, seem to be designed for potentially extreme destruction. And then, of course, I mean, you could potentially ask, okay, what is there that makes certain left people enjoy these fantasies about geoengineering? Well, maybe they're looking for a way out, as we all are. I don't think I would apply some of the psychoanalytical categories around fetishism and stuff like that on these comrades. You can psychoanalyze the enemy in that way, but not your comrades that you disagree with, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for writing How to Blow Up a Pipeline. That was really seminal for me when I was 22, so thank you. My question is, recently I tried to write a piece highlighting prominent criminal ecological crimes committed by Canadian banks, and I faced this nihilistic barrage of the idea that people simply don't want to know about the bad things being done by corporations. How do we get past this perceived denial of the general public? And how do we convey our message exposing these crimes or exposing a way out of these crimes and investments that breaks through this denial of indifference?
Well, if I had an answer to that, I would gladly share it, but I don't think I have. I mean, it's become very difficult for me to offer like a model for how this can be achieved, especially since the trend since some time seems to be hardening denial, as I said. So I don't know. I mean, there has, of course, long been this expectation that when climate disasters become really bad, people will wake up. But that doesn't really seem to be the case. Could just as well be the other way around. I mean, in studies in the US, there have been these findings that Republicans, when they actually experience a climate disaster, become even more denialist about the climate crisis. So, and for things like banks and stuff like that, this is so difficult because, one of the constant hurdles or difficulties when it comes to climate mobilization is that these things tend to be mediated, and there are causal chains that are abstract and span a lot of spaces, and the violence that is being inflicted on people is very hard to pinpoint. It's not as in your face as the violence in a genocide, for instance, which makes at least quite a lot of people enraged and prompt them to go out onto the streets and protest that violence obviously for good reason. Or something like the murder of George Floyd, which was one man on top of another, captured on screen, and you could immediately see the violent impact, and this couldn't be denied. But you can't capture the violence of banks investing in fossil fuels and how this causes the displacement of 2 million people in Punjab in the floods in that direct way. So it's much more difficult to break through the denial and mobilize action around that this time. But yeah, like I said, I'm sure if you've researched this, you have better responses than I do.
We can take a couple more questions. So way in the back there, and then you with the education, sir, and then finally you. Okay?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I think something I was thinking about during it was the maybe psychical heterogeneity of the bourgeois subject. And I've been following a lot of Christina Vesperis' recent work on the question of climate response, and she's been Freedom of Information acting a lot of information about how the Department of Defense is preparing. And it's actually not this repressive response at all. It's quite explicitly preparing for climate collapse, looking at things like energy infrastructure networks, understanding how a monopoly on energy could maintain in the context of climate collapse. So for me, the kind of speculative case of a Trump going oh, we can turn to this geoengineering, I'm not sure that that's the guaranteed kind of fascistic response, especially in the context of these immense research enterprises trying to understand how to capitalize on collapse. And so I know you said you don't like Lacan, but I kind of thought I was having you guys turning to Lacan too. There's also a kind of bourgeois subjective response that is symptomatic in the sense that it actually is seeking to take pleasure in the collapse, pleasure in the symptom. And so maybe if you could speak to like disarticulating the psychic life of the discourse of geoengineering from a kind of universal theory of the bourgeois subject, or maybe there are ways to reconcile these things, but I just wanted to kind of throw in.
Okay, let me be very concrete here and say that if you look at the bourgeois subject of Donald Trump and the average Republican lunatic in the US, there is a heterogeneity that is remarkable in that the US is probably the country right now where you have the strongest movement against geoengineering. And this has two manifestations. One is the chemtrail conspiracy theory, where you have all these Americans believing that geoengineering is already happening, and it's done by the state to manipulate us, kill our babies or whatever. You know, this chemtrails conspiracy theory has an enormous amount of popular support in the US, and here you can really pity the actual geoengineering scholars who are trying. I mean, most of them are, I think, have good intentions. David Keith and these people, they're trying to come up with a technology that would help us in an emergency, but all of these people are reacting with fundamental madness, imagining things that aren't there. And then you have another version of this, which is they're actually preparing geoengineering to treat the climate crisis that doesn't exist. This is another denialist version of opposition to geoengineering. So in the US, you've seen in the past year a lot of legislative initiatives to ban geoengineering. There was, after the Texas flood some time back, there was this idea that this was because of chemtrails, so you had these initiatives to ban chemtrails. And you also have various Republican legislators around the country introducing various types of bans on geoengineering experiments and research. So there is no guarantee that the far right will adopt geoengineering. It could take this even crazier denialist position. Denial has a way of just compounding itself and spiraling into new types of insanity all the time. So I'm not. This was another big chunk of the psychology of geoengineering that I left out here. There's a great, purely empirical heterogeneity in the bourgeois subject around these matters. And since you're asking about Lacan again, let me just very personally psychoanalyze my own preference here. I spend almost half my time in France. I massively prefer France over Germany in terms of people are nicer, the food is better, everything is aesthetically more pleasurable in France. The politics is infinitely superior. But I cannot get going on French theory. And I have an absolute preference for German, or to be more exact, German Jewish theory, the critical theory that was developed by Jewish scholars of a Marxist orientation who had a central experience to grapple with, which was defeat and catastrophe. French theory was developed by communists whose main problem was the status of the Communist Party, which is, in comparison, a very nice situation to be in. But it doesn't generate a body of theory that is as pertinent to the present moment, because our moment is a moment of catastrophe. This is why the critical theory, to me, makes so much more sense as an intellectual tradition than French theory. You know, critical theory, Adorno and these people, they are the only Marxists who have focused their work around the category of catastrophe. You don't have that in France. For obvious reasons. The Holocaust didn't happen in France, right? There was no defeat of a major revolution in 1918. This would be my own explanation for why I prefer the German stuff only on this segment of reality.
Okay, go ahead. After the final question will be from you, Vlad, okay?
Thank you very much for your talk. I noticed that you mentioned the death drive, which I assume you're subscribing to the orthodox Freudian view that there is a death instinct, but there's a type of social psychology, terror management theory, which comes out of Freudian psychoanalysis but denies the death drive and instead says that what appears to be an instinctual death drive is actually a desire for more life, that there's such an unconscious denial of death that drives pretty much all of our behavior in that, including culture, including the pursuit of status and power and money, basically to ward off death. So I was wondering if what your thoughts were on this interpretation of Freudian psychoanalysis, and if tackling the denial of death and widespread acceptance of our death, both individually and on a cultural level, would help in combating ecocide, climate change, and so forth. Thank you.
A good question. Maybe you have a better answer than I do to this. I think so. I don't really know I don't really know what to answer, to be honest. But yes, I'm orthodox in the sense that I think the death drive is totally a scientifically valid concept, and that it's present in our moment. But of course, in Freud's own work, there are different theories of the death drive. There is the beyond the pleasure principle, kind of internal death drive, the wish to just dissolve in inanimate matter. And then in Civilization and Discontent is the extrovert, the aggressive death drive, which is linked to narcissistic rage and this stuff. And it's this thing that I think you can actually empirically observe in a lot of fascist politics today.
Sir? Yeah, I just I'm in the unenviable position of asking the last question. How to solve. So I wanted to ask about the second penis.
The what?
The second penis.
Yeah.
As a kind of supplement that geoengineering offers to global capital.
Yes.
To kind of keep it going by keeping things the same, protect scrap assets and so on. It seems like in this kind of speculative world where the billionaires are trying to avoid castration anxiety through this, through solar radiation management, there's a kind of sovereignty that would be required.
Yes.
And you brought up a couple of examples, right? Like one is Trump is too hot on the stage, and the other is the IDF or IAF with this experiment, Macbeth. But I mean, what do you think about the model of sovereignty and maybe the role that technoscience would play in that? Because would it simply be, here's the U.S. military once again maintaining a certain status quo for capital, or is there the potential for a different kind of sovereignty to emerge with geoengineering, which might then have kind of implications for resistance or for Marxist internationalism? Beyond that, I don't know where to go.
No, it's another good and big question. I think the final chapter in our book is called The Empire of the Stratosphere and discusses these questions around sovereignty and who is likely to do this. And as far as we can tell, all the literature suggests that if geoengineering is going to work, it has to be one actor who does it. You can't have multiple actors doing geoengineering in different ways, then it will be chaos. So you will have to have someone who exercises some kind of monopoly on stratospheric violence, if you like. And this is, according to the best research, and at the current moment, yes, likely to be the United States. Because the United States is by far the dominant military superpower in the world, and it's very difficult to imagine that the US would let anyone else do it. That the US would let China or Russia, someone outside of its imperial core, seize this tremendous power of controlling the global thermostat through geoengineering. And already now, the US has established a program for detecting geoengineering experiments all around the world. to make sure that if anyone does it somewhere else, we're going to know about it. And we also argue that it's very unlikely that the state of Israel will be the agent of geoengineering. You know, the function of the state of Israel in the current moment is to function as a laboratory, to test various kinds of technologies for suppressing people. And then these technologies are then imported into the core. This is the logic of the Palestine Laboratory, the book by Anthony Lowenstein, for instance. And geoengineering here operates again in this way. But it's very, very unlikely that it would be the state of Israel itself that enacts a deployment if it ever happens, for various reasons. You know, David Keith and these people, they acknowledge, yes, it's going to have to be a very centralized sovereignty, because it's the only way this technology can work. And this, of course, it's quite dystopic potentials for global authoritarian rule through the climate. And it doesn't really open up for Marxist, you know, there have been these fantasies about DIY geoengineering, that you can have some kind of a mass, spontaneous geoengineering movement where everyone releases their own balloons with sulfate aerosols and stuff like that. This seems very far-fetched and unlikely to happen.
Okay, well, listen, thank you all for coming, and let us thank Professor Malm.